Hey, I want to thank David for the message last Sunday. If you missed that, it's just a tremendously practical message, the significance of our time. And that's a great series that they've put together, just walking us through some of the practical issues of daily Christian living. So thank you, David. If you missed that, that's online for you to listen to at any time. And I do want to say also, things are a little different at LifePoint than they were a few years ago, just because of what's been going on with me. And I know there may be some questions surrounding that. You know, why are we doing things the way we are? If that's the case, feel free to come and ask me. I'll be happy to talk to you about any of it. The fact is, it's, you know, a man doesn't want to admit this, but I'm just not where I was a few years ago in my strength, in my health, and since the open heart surgery that they said would make me feel like Superman, it's actually made me feel worse than I ever felt before. So I'm just working through all this. I'm trying my best to look at every aspect of this and every angle of it, but honestly, I just feel horrible every day when I wake up, every single day, and it's a battle to kind of push myself through doing what I'm doing. And so the elders have graciously tried to accommodate for that and sort of build some guardrails around me so that I don't run myself into the ground again. And so I'm just not able to keep up the pace that I used to. I'm not able to meet with everyone on the schedule that I used to, and I feel awful about that. But that's just where we are. That's what's going on, in case you're wondering what's happening and why we're on kind of a different schedule that we are. But I'm frustrated by it, honestly, some days. Very frustrated, because men are proud, and we don't like to admit that we need help with anything. So God's working in my heart on that, to not be such a jerk, and to accept where I am in this, and to be wise about it. That's the big thing. That's the thing I've struggled with my whole life, and maybe some of you men have as well. You just kind of think, well, faithfulness means just going until you drop dead. And that's just not very wise. That benefits no one in the long run. And so here we are, and we're doing the best we can with all this, and God has been so gracious and good through it all. And I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful. If you would, take your Bibles and turn to Esther chapter 1. Esther chapter 1. Now again, there's a little overview of the Bible. We've been jumping around so much as we're making our way through the Bible. We're teaching the Bible in chronological order, not in book order. And so the last time I taught, we were there near the very end of the yellow section in the books of Haggai and Zechariah. And now we jump all the way back in our Bibles to just before Job and Psalms, to where that red bookmark is, to the book of Esther, because Esther is the one that comes next in that timeline. Now, Esther is a phenomenal book, but it's one of those books that if you don't take the time up front to set the stage and the context for the events in this book, the book might be nice to go through, but it just will not mean as much as it could otherwise. So I want to take a few minutes this morning by way of introduction to this book to set the stage and put the events of this book into the timeline that we've been following. So a quick reminder now that many years earlier, King Nebuchadnezzar had attacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, destroyed much of the city, and torn the city walls down. And most of the people in Jerusalem had been carried away to Babylon as prisoners of war. Now, time has gone by. They've spent 70 years in exile, 70 years in Babylon. And then we come to, first of all, the year 539, when Persia came along and conquered Babylon. And then 1 year later, in 538, God moved in the heart of King Cyrus. We saw this as we opened the book of Ezra. God moved in the heart of King Cyrus to let the Jews return to Jerusalem. And that's what we studied in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. They began rebuilding their temple, but just 2 years into that project, they stopped because of fear. and that project was abandoned completely for 16 years. And that's when God sent two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to come and correct and encourage the people to get them back on track, rebuilding the temple, which they did in 520 BC. And so we just finished looking at all that in the books of Haggai and Zechariah. And what comes next in the historical timeline, even though it doesn't come next in your Bible, is the book of Esther. And for the next 7 Sundays, God willing, I'm going to have the privilege of walking with you through this book of Esther, and that'll take us up to somewhere around near the end of August. Now, all those things took place. This is just all to set the scene here so we can get an idea of historically what's going on and when. All those things took place between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. So as you read through the book of Ezra, as is often the case in the Bible, you'll turn a page, and in the turn of a page, 10, 20, 30, 40 years may go by. And there's silence in there. Except in this case, between Ezra 6 and 7, we have all kinds of history that we can look to, but we just need to learn how to slot it in the correct place. Now, maybe no one's ever told you that that's where the book of Ezra took place, but there it is. So for now, as I said, we've put a bookmark at the end of Ezra chapter 6, and when we finish Esther, we're going to go back and pick up at Ezra chapter 7, study through the end of Ezra, which is also when the book of Nehemiah takes place, and then we'll conclude our journey through the Old Testament with the book of Malachi. Everybody clear on that? So look, I tried to make this as simple as I could. It's still not simple, I understand, but I think just maybe by the process of repetition, if we see this enough, we'll begin to kind of slot things into their proper place. And as I've tried to do as we've gone through the Bible series, I've tried to include world events that took place right along with the biblical timeline that we've been studying. And so just to give you some idea there of when these things are happening, Confucius died around the time of Haggai and Zechariah. Socrates was born around the life of Esther. The Parthenon was being built in Greece. Plato was born, and so on. And that'll give you just a little idea of where we are. Okay. Guys in the back, I'm going to turn that back over to you because this drives me completely insane, trying to think and use that remote at the same time. I don't know how you guys do it. I must be so uncoordinated. It throws me off. So y'all take it from here. Now, in order for the book of Esther to make sense, in the time and the place that it occurred, there are 3 crucial details that I want you to understand. First, when the Jews were allowed to leave Babylon and return home to Jerusalem, not all of them returned. History tells us that many of them, many tens of thousands of them, chose to stay in Babylon. So back in our minds now in Ezra chapter 1, when we're told that God moved on the heart of King Cyrus, the Persian king who had just conquered Babylon, to allow the Jews to return home, to rebuild their temple, many of the Jews in captivity said, nah, we're going to stay here. I want you to take special note of that, because that detail will become a key piece of information as we make our way through the book of Esther. Secondly, we must keep in mind that those who remained in exile weren't actually in Babylon anymore. As I said earlier, Persia came along and conquered Babylon in 539 BC. So those remaining exiles were now technically under the rule of the Persian Empire. So King Nebuchadnezzar, who started all this back in 605 and 597 and 586, when Jerusalem was destroyed, King Nebuchadnezzar's gone. He's off the scene. King Cyrus, who began the process of allowing the Jews to return home, he's off the scene. King Darius, his reign has ended. And now his son, a man named either Xerxes or Ahasuerus, I'll explain that in a moment, is the king of Persia. Actually, let me explain that now. Some of your versions, as we go through Esther, will say Ahasuerus. Some will say Xerxes. Now, the reason for that is quite simple, maybe not simple in our vernacular or our understanding. But the reason that two names are used is Xerxes is the Greek version of his Persian name. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew version of the same name. Now, in the original Persian, his name would have been pronounced, and I can't pronounce it. No one can. It's spelled Khshayarsha. So let's just be thankful we have a choice between Xerxes and Ahasuerus. I still don't know which name I'm going to use as we go through this. But I'll probably be back and forth just as a reminder that he's called by both names. Now, this is not so extremely unusual. We have, I didn't ask their permission to do this, but they're sweet folks, and I don't think they'll mind. So most of you, I'm sure, know the lovely family from South Africa who's here, part of our church, the De Wets, right? So they have good, strong Afrikaans names. His name is Jacobus. Her name is Machtel. Now, when they came over here to America, everybody they met and introduced themselves to would go, "What?" And so they had to repeat their name several times. Then they had to spell their name. And they figured we're wasting half our life introducing ourselves to people. And so now, most of you don't know them by Jacobus and Machtel. Jacobus said, "Just call me Jake." Machtel said, "Just call me Maggie." And it made life a whole lot easier for them and for everybody else. Now imagine if hundreds or thousands of years from now, people were digging through the archives of Greenville and South Africa and other countries, and they saw these last names, De Wet. There's one in Greenville, there's one in South Africa. Well, that's weird though. It's Jacobus and Machtel here in South Africa, that's what the history says, but over here it says Jake and Maggie. Well, that must be an error. Well, it's not an error at all. It's just a simple explanation for two understandings, two transliterations of someone's name. So that's exactly what's going on here. So in this story, one of the main characters that we'll be introduced to in just a second in chapter 1 is a king named Xerxes, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus. You can spell that on your own. So first, not all the Jews chose to leave exile and return home. Second, those who did remain in Babylon were not under Babylonian rule anymore. They were under Persian rule. Babylon has fallen. Persian is now the new world empire. Third and finally, there's an important fact we must know about the book of Esther before we read it. That is, God is not mentioned once in the entire book of Esther. Not once. God is not mentioned at all in this book. Now that gives some people fits. It causes them to bring their own cleverness to this and give reasons why it shouldn't be that way. But frankly, to me, it's beautiful because the book of Esther, perhaps more than any other book in the Bible, shows us God in the most realistic and relatable way possible. Because throughout the Old Testament, as we've been studying all these great books up to this point, we've seen God creating the universe through his spoken word. We've seen God parting the Red Sea, bringing water from the rock, causing the sun to stand still, appearing as a pillar of fire at night. But in the book of Esther, God's not mentioned at all. We don't see blinding flashes of his glory. We don't see jaw-dropping displays of his power. And yet his power is at work behind every page of this book. God is unnamed in the book of Esther, but his signature is everywhere. He's hidden from these pages, yet he's powerfully present. And folks, can we just drop the churchy religiosity stuff for just a moment and admit that isn't that really how our lives work most days? We're busy with life, all the stuff of life. And the problems come from left and right, and most times, if we're honest, we would have to say, We have to pause an awful lot and remind ourselves that God is present because it doesn't feel like he is. That's not a very Christian-sounding thing to say, but that's the truth. How often do we have to reassure ourselves of God's presence, that he's involved in our lives, that he knows what's going on, that he understands, that he cares about what's happening in our lives, even though it sometimes doesn't feel like he is? And so the book of Esther is exactly how it should be, because it's meant to drive home this vital reminder. And I put this on the screen, hopefully to help us remember this. Just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. That's my best attempt to sum up the entire book of Esther. So if you want to skip the next 7 weeks, you've already got it right there. Just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. And that's a truth that you and I need to learn sooner rather than later, because there are going to be seasons in life when it feels like God is nowhere to be found. I don't care how spiritual you are. I don't care how many Bible verses you've memorized. I don't care how many ministries you serve in. There are going to be times in this life when it seems like God has abandoned you. What do you do in those moments, in those seasons? Our faith will only remain anchored in times like that by trusting with unshakable confidence in the providence of God. This is what the book of Esther is about, the providence of God, even though we cannot see it. The providence of God. Here's my best attempt to boil that down. It's knowing, not hoping, knowing that God is working out his purposes even when there is no visible evidence of it, and that he is doing what is right even when our circumstances tell us otherwise. It's knowing with certainty that God is working out his purposes even when there's no visible evidence of it, and that he is doing what is right even when our circumstances tell us otherwise. And so with those three important foundation pillars in place, let's now actually get to Esther chapter 1. And may I ask you, if you would, if you're able to stand as we read God's word again. I want to read the first, what do we have here? The first 12 verses. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. This happened in the days of Ahasuerus or Xerxes, the same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now, just before verse 2, I want to show you this map. I want us to understand what we've just read. Everything you see in green was owned and ruled over by King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. That is a massive swath of the world. In fact, from west to east, that is pretty much the entire known world at that time. That's what this king rules over. Verse 2. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom in the citadel of Shushan or Susa, I'll explain that later, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast or a banquet for all his officials and servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces were present, while he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Verse 5. And at the end of this time, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from the great to the small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. You wives don't get any ideas about redecorating. Verse 7. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. In other words, you've seen these video clips of the former queen having a party, and everyone is to watch her. They're not to touch their fork until she does. They're not to take a drink until she does. This king said, hey, it's a free-for-all. Drink whenever you want, as much as you want. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Interesting that they had to add that bit in. He wants you to know, oh, it's her palace, but I own it. Verse 10, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, wink, wink, he commanded those 7 guys who served in the presence of the king, watch this, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Now, verse 12, we wrap it up with this. And this sets in motion everything that happens in the rest of this book. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Thank you. You may be seated. We're introduced here to a man who is a big shot. He knows he's a big shot, and he wants everyone else to know he's a big shot. We're given just a small glimpse of his incredible power and wealth. In fact, it's interesting to me, you don't have to bring that verse up again, but verse 4 uses words to describe him that are reserved to describe God alone. And make no mistake, this wasn't an accident by the author of this book. The author is telling us something here. Verse 4 uses words to describe this king that are typically in the Bible only reserved for God. Glory, splendor, majesty. Those are words used to describe this king. And verse 4 also told us the reason for this party was to show everyone his riches and his splendor. Now, we actually know a lot about this king through secular history because the Persian Empire has yielded probably one of the richest archaeological finds in all of history. Tens of thousands of artifacts have been found from the Persian Empire, from Shushan or Susa, the sort of the summer capital of Persia. For instance, go to that next slide. Thousands of items have been found, many of which contain inscriptions about King Ahasuerus himself or inscriptions by him. Let me read just a segment of one of those for you. If you go to that next slide, this will give you a quick idea of the king's arrogance. He had this inscribed about himself, and they found it on this massive engraving in a rock there. I am Xerxes, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing many kinds of men, king of this great earth far and wide. It doesn't take long to get the picture here. He was Mr. Big. He ruled most of the known world at that time. He threw parties that lasted for 6 months. He owned the finest of everything, and his power was unlimited, and he was proud of it all. Archaeologists found one amazing artifact that reveals just how much he thought of himself. Go to that next slide. Isn't that amazing? That's actually a statue of King Xerxes there. It's remarkable that t-shirt lasted 2,500 years. All right, get that off. This man was the ruler of the world. He was big stuff, and he knew it, and he wanted you to know it. Now, the author of this book is building us up for a fall. This opening chapter is going above and beyond in describing the grandeur and the greatness and the might and the power of this one man. Because we're going to see that time has the same outcome for all of us. No matter who we are, no matter what we own, no matter how important we are, we're all going to die. This great man who ruled the world, where is he now? 2,500 years later, he's gone, he's off the scene, and nobody cares. But even in the opening verses that we just read, we get a hint, just a little hint that something is wrong. He's not as in control as he thinks he is. It's remarkable. He's in control of 127 provinces, but he can't control his own emotions. We're told that just as this party was in high gear and the king was merry with wine, you know what I mean? Merry with wine. He sends not one, not two, but 7 of his men, not to ask, but to command his wife to come to the party where all these men are. They had separate parties. He commands his wife to come to this party where all these drunken men are because it's very clear he wants to parade her around in front of the men and show off her beauty. Now, you can make of this what you will. Some people say, Phil, there's nothing going on. He was just proud of his wife. Ask any woman in this room or any woman in the world. How would you feel if your husband brought you in front of a room full of drunken men to parade you around? Would you feel honored or would you feel objectified? I think we're given all sorts of incriminating details here as to the motive of this. It says, all the men were partying and drinking together. We know how that turns out. Secondly, it says the king had clearly reached his tipping point on wine. We know how that turns out. Third, he ordered his wife to come. He didn't say, hey, hon, would you? No. Send 7 men to order my wife to come. Fourth, he wanted her to come to show her beauty to the other men. And fifth, because she was beautiful to look at. This is such a subtle but revealing window into this man's heart. All of these objects that he put on display during this 6-month party, he owned all that stuff. He put it on display for everyone to see. And at the end of this party, it's as though he thought, you know, there's one more thing I own that I haven't shown off. My wife. And I get the sense that his wife, at this point in his life at least, we'll see a slight change in the next chapter, but at this point in his life, his wife was just an object. She was a trophy. And he foolishly wanted to bring her to the party so that other men could look at her. But what's revealed without ever being said here is that his wife had more morals than he did, because she said no. Now, that doesn't mean much to us today, but you didn't say no to these Persian kings. The queen did not say no to her husband. Notice, this was a command. She was his subject. He said, go get my wife, bring her here, and parade her around. Vashti had more morals than her husband did. And she said, tell him no. The king became enraged, and it says he burned with anger. Now, this is a pattern with this king. You don't have to turn there, but if we jump ahead to Esther chapter 7, verse 7, it says this, "Then the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking." And there it is again. So here was a king who controlled 127 provinces, but he couldn't control himself. And the rest of chapter 1 tells us that in his anger, he called in his wise men. And he asked them what to do about this situation. Now understand, he had just been humiliated in front of everyone. His wife stood him up. And he's embarrassed, he's angry, he's vengeful. And can I just tell you, that is a terrible time to make critical decisions. So he called in his wise men. He asked them what to do. It seems clear from this passage that he had surrounded himself with yes men. Men who would tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. So these wise men came in and they said, "Look, king," and you can read this for yourselves in the rest of chapter 1. They said, "Look, Queen Vashti has embarrassed you, and she needs to be publicly punished as an example to all the other wives." They actually went on to say, if this goes unchecked, word's going to get out among all the provinces, and all the wives are going to rebel against their husbands. And we can't have that. It's going to be the beginning of the women's lib movement. And so they said to the king, here's what you need to do. You need to put a law in place right now to banish Vashti from the kingdom forever. Make a public spectacle of her and make it so that she'll never be allowed to enter your presence again. I'm quoting from these verses. And then, king, here's what you do. You go out and you find yourself a new wife who is better than her. Again, I'm quoting. You go find yourself a wife who's better than her. Now, I don't have time to pause on this for long, but can I just say, as upstanding Greenville citizens, moral people trying to live right, we read this and we're disgusted by it, and rightly so. We think, what kind of man would ever do that to his wife? Do we not see this all day long? It's so common with men. I don't know what it is. They reach a point in life when they go mad. And they begin to think, for some bizarre reason, that they're all that, but they need to trade in their wife for a younger, newer, better model. And it happens all the time. Hey, buddy, go get yourself a wife who's better than her. Men, I want to tell you, don't be a fool in this area. If you ever get those feelings creeping into your mind, first of all, go take a good long look in the mirror. You ain't no prize. There are not women lining up for you. Okay, get that out of your head. Every man believes in the secret depths of his heart that he is 2 push-ups away from being Arnold Schwarzenegger. Every man believes that. You look in the mirror like, I'm right there, baby. I'm just so close. No, you're not, buddy. You're miles away. Men, listen. If I had $100 for every hour I had counseled people in their marriage, especially the husband. It's not always the case by any means. I'm painting with a very broad brush here, I know. But especially husbands who have destroyed their family because they got some stupid, arrogant notion in their head to trade in their wife for a better model. Men, you will not find a better model. And if your wife is not beautiful and lovely in your eyes after 10, 20, 30, 40 years, then it's your fault, not hers. Well, that got awful quiet. So that's what they said to the king. Hey, banish this woman, make it public, and then go find yourself a better wife. Esther chapter 1, verse 21. And the reply pleased the king. And he did according to what they said. See, in his rage, the king agreed to make a decision that would affect the rest of his life. And in this case, the rest of history. And he put in place a law. I'm sure you've heard the famous phrase, the law of the Medes and Persians. This goes back to, we saw this in Daniel, right? When the king was tricked into putting a law in place that no one could pray to anyone but the king, and Daniel violated that law, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And it says that the king paced back and forth all night long because he liked Daniel. And even he could not repeal the law that he had put in place. This was the Persians. If the king put a law in place, not even he could reverse it. That's what happened here. Put this law in place, Queen Vashti is banished forever, and it will never be repealed. And if you want to get just a little sneak peek ahead, I didn't bring the verse, but you can peek ahead to chapter 2, verse 1, and you can see now some couple of years later, we'll talk about this next week, you can see where this decision landed King Xerxes. That's just a brief introduction to this book, but what I want us to see is what's really happening here. Yeah, all the people in that time could see at that moment was a bunch of political and relational drama. What they couldn't see was that God was working directly through these events to position Esther to become the next queen so she could ultimately be used by God to save the Jews from annihilation and ensure the coming of the promised Messiah. No big deal. Behind the scenes of those ordinary events, God's grand will was being brought about. It's just that no one could see it at the time. And we need to remember this. We need to remember this in the midst of the events of our lives that seem to be nothing but annoyances and setbacks. You know, that broken appliance at home, that broken down car. What an annoyance this is. That severed friendship. That hurts so bad. That unwanted doctor's report. That unexpected job loss. That child who's turned their back and walked away. Frankly, God does seem absent from those events most of the time, does he not, church? He just does. We must never forget that in all that chapter 1 mess that we've just looked at, God was right there, using it all to bring about his perfect will, even though no one could see him doing it. So the real question is, are we going to trust God even when we don't see him? For all those times and places and circumstances in our lives when God seems to be absent, we can rest assured that he is very near. And that's something this book is going to teach us. To learn to trust in the unfailing providence of God, in the unseen hand of God. Let me share these words of a great old hymn with you. I didn't put it all on the screen, it was too much. Written in 1774. Think about that. 1774 by William Cowper. God moves in a mysterious way. Here's what he said. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. We will all experience times in life when we ask, God, where are you? Maybe you're there this morning. God, I've prayed, I've read my Bible, I've cried, I've waited. Where are you? I want you to know that the true proof of our faith will not come when our hands are raised in worship on a Sunday morning. Our faith will only be proven true in those moments when it seems that God is nowhere to be found. How will we live in those times, church? How will you? How will I? I'm excited about going through this book because the book of Esther is going to teach us that just because God is silent does not mean he is absent. I've been praying that this little book will draw us individually and as a church into a deeper life of faith in God than we've ever known before. Come join me on this journey, will you? Let's pray. Father, I do and I am able to say thank you for those times when you hide yourself. I can't say I enjoy them. I can't say I look forward to them, but looking back on them, every one of them, I see that those are the times when my faith grew the most. Those are the times when my trust in you was strengthened to steel. And when I proved to myself that my commitment to you, frail as it may be, is genuine, that I do love you, that I do want to follow you no matter what. So God, I thank you for those times when you don't make it all easy and plain for us. And I know there are people in that place right now this morning. I know that because I've talked to them over the last couple of weeks and months. There are many others, I'm sure, that I don't know of. I pray, Lord, I pray that as we step into this book of the unseen hand of God, that you would do a work in each of their lives, in all of our lives, that will draw us closer to you in those dark, quiet seasons than we've ever been before. Do a great work through this, we ask, in Jesus' name. Amen.